lecture on cellular respiration. You should have out your note guide, the concept maps that you printed to go along with this lecture. It will really help you to understand the concept better. This is the first concept map that you can see if you were able to copy that one from and print it out with the lecture. This is the whole process of cellular respiration. We call it aerobic respiration because it requires oxygen. And then it's divided into 3 parts. Glycolysis being the first step, Krebs cycle the second, and the electron transport chain as the third. Glycolysis literally means sugar splitting. This is where the glucose is broken down into 2 pyruvate molecules. When that happens, 2 ATP are released. That creates hydrogen ions and electrons. Both the hydrogen ions and the electrons are carried by these molecules NAD and FAD. When they pick up the electrons, they turn into NADH and FADH2. These bypass the second step and go straight to the electron transport chain. What happens in the second step, the Krebs cycle, is the pyruvates that were originally broken apart in glycolysis are broken down even further, and that's where our CO2 is released. This process also creates electrons and hydrogen ions, which are carried on the same molecules to the electron transport chain. All of this happens in the mitochondria, and it makes a lot of ATP, which is energy for our cells. So cellular respiration occurs in 2 ways. It can be, this is something that all heterotrophs do, as well as autotrophs. They make their sugar and then break it down during cellular respiration. There's 2 ways. The first way is aerobic, the one we just discussed, and that requires oxygen. This makes a lot more ATP and is much more efficient than the second type, which is anaerobic respiration. This is in the absence of oxygen, so no oxygen is needed, but it doesn't make much ATP, so it's not very efficient at all. Aerobic respiration occurs in 3 separate steps. The first one is glycolysis. The second is a citric acid cycle. This is also called the Krebs cycle. And the third is the electron transport chain. Here's the equation for general cellular respiration. We start with glucose, C6H12O6, and it requires oxygen. Those 2 go through processes that release carbon dioxide, and water is also a byproduct here. What's missing from this equation? Energy. Since we had energy going in, we need to have energy coming out as well. The goals of the reactions for glycolysis is to break apart the sugar and recharge some ATP batteries. For the second step, it's to collect hydrogen and get rid of the waste products, specifically the CO2 is the waste, and the electron transport chain uses hydrogen to make the ATP. This is the big money maker for the energy in this process. In glycolysis, we take a glucose molecule, which has 6 carbons, and turn it into 2 3-carbon pyruvates. So a pyruvate is basically just half of a sugar. This all takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. This process itself is anaerobic. So this part of the process is anaerobic. This does not require oxygen, as the next 2 steps do. Glucose won't break by itself, so we have to spend some ATP to get it back. So it actually costs the cell 2 ATP, but it makes 4 for a net gain of 2 ATP. Notice the NAD is the taxi. This is the thing that carries the hydrogen ions and the electrons from glycolysis to the step of the electron transport chain. Here we see the glucose being broken down into 2 pyruvates. But these 2 molecules here do not add up to equal that. What's missing? It's the hydrogens. Extra hydrogens fall off and are picked up by the NADH and taken to the electron transport chain. So based on what happens in glycolysis, what do you think the job of NADH is? And what is it holding? Basically, it's just a transport. All it does is take the electrons and hydrogen ions from one place to another. The next step is the citric acid cycle, or Krebs cycle. These names are interchangeable. They mean the same process, that's just two words for the same thing. This is where each pyruvate gets broken down further. It takes place in the cristae, which, as you can see in the diagram, are the folds right on the inside of the mitochondria. In this process, this is where the CO2 is released. This also makes more NAD, and it captures more of that and takes the NADH to the hydrogen ions to be used later in the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain, hydrogen ions are moved using NAD to the cristae. What happens here is that the hydrogens then leave the carrier and move across the cristae, and in so doing so generate a ton of energy. This is where most of our energy is made for this process. The energy is harvested and built even more ATP. This is really the place where we get the majority of the energy for this process. Those hydrogen ions then combine with the oxygen to make water. That's why we get the byproduct of H2O. So hydrogen is also often called the ultimate electron acceptor because it picks up those hydrogens at the very end. Here's a picture of the process. The hydrogen ions and the electrons are dropped off here and moved through an electron transport chain, pumping hydrogen ions as they go. Then, those hydrogen ions move through the ATP synthase, and in doing so, generate ATP. You have another diagram that looks just like this, and it might be good for you to fill this in as well as we go through the process here. So the electron transport system, this is kind of flip-flopped here because if we go through the process of photosynthesis, it's very much a mirror process. So we're going to start down here with glucose, and glucose gets broken down during glycolysis into 2-pyruvate. This generates 2 ATP right here. Then those pyruvate go into the citric acid cycle. This is also called the Krebs cycle, and in doing so generate ATP as well, and release carbon dioxide as a waste. This box right here represents the mitochondria, which is why the glucose and glycolysis happen on the outside of it, because these take place in the cytoplasm. The NAD picks up the hydrogens and drops them off at the electron transport system, and then the NAD goes back to get more. And this just creates a cycle of NADH picking up hydrogens and dropping them off, and then going back to get more. The electron transport chain does require oxygen, and water is released as a byproduct. Another byproduct that hasn't been mentioned till now is heat. That is how we generate a lot of our body heat, and here we get tons of ATP being produced. Here's another diagram that shows the same thing, but just in a different context. So glucose is seen in the cytoplasm here. ATP and NADH are produced when it gets broken into pyruvate. Then the pyruvate goes into the citric acid cycle. This is a smaller step here, the acetyl-CoA. That's kind of a middleman step that we're not going to focus on. Citric acid cycle produces NADH as well, which goes to the electron transport chain and in turn produces lots of ATP. Citric acid cycle releases carbon dioxide. The electron transport chain requires oxygen, which is the ultimate electron acceptor, and produces water. Here is another diagram that you can actually fill in as we go through this together so that you can see, so this can help you for in the future. So these guys here are the pyruvate. These pyruvate molecules here are 3 carbon sugars. Excuse my handwriting. Then they go into the process here of the citric acid cycle. This takes place in the cristae and creates ATP. This whole molecule here is the mitochondria. Right? These molecules that are being released here are CO2. Those are a waste product. The things that carry on to the next step are the NADH and the FADH2. Here we see these oxygen molecules going into the electron transport chain and coming out as water once they have picked up the hydrogens from the previous step. This is the same diagram that we just filled in, but it also shows how the mirror process is with photosynthesis. See how everything is exactly opposite? We have the electron transport system, which is also the same as the photosystems, just in reverse. Calvin cycle is pretty much the reverse of the citric acid cycle. So they're very much mirror processes, and they happen pretty much exact reverse. With anaerobic respiration, this is where the cells get energy without using any oxygen. They are able to get just a small amount of energy. Not a whole lot is made during this process, so it is not necessarily, it's not going to be the most efficient way of doing it. It's not usually the main way that cells get energy. This is when we make no ATP is produced. It just allows the NAD to get rid of the hydrogens. So the same thing happens. Glycolysis still occurs, and then instead of going into the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, instead it goes to fermentation. And during fermentation, no more energy is created. It just takes the hydrogens off so that NAD can continue and go back and do more glycolysis. We have alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation as the two types that you need to know. Alcoholic fermentation occurs in yeast and fungus. The byproducts are alcohol and carbon dioxide. This is the type of alcoholic fermentation that we use to make alcohol that we drink. Lactic acid fermentation occurs in your muscles. It occurs in animals, and lactic acid is a byproduct instead of alcohol and carbon dioxide, and this is what makes your muscles feel very fatigued or kind of give out when you're working hard. That concludes our lesson today. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact Mrs. Jewett so that you can get any questions taken care of. Go ahead and continue with your lesson and scroll down so that you can complete the assignments. Have a great day.